ourselves to have this vast territory of production that we just don't want to talk about. It's just the backing on the mirror.
Who's the we?
Yeah.
I'll talk about it.
Yeah, so I'm curious, actually, I'm curious to know what you think about it, because I have, my opinion is that as an artist, and I'm obviously making photographs and very interested in photography, but at the same time I feel that it may be the backing on the mirror, but I actually, most of the time, have no relationship to it other than, you know, like you said, the plumber goes in and says, well, the urinal's just a urinal. For me, I could say that the redundancy or the multiplicity is also just there, but it's there the way I encounter other things phenomenologically. So I'm curious how you could describe it, because you have, in a way, dare I say, a slightly more sentimental relationship to some of these descriptions of photography that I'm a little bit more confused about, I guess. Not dubious, but definitely confused, because I'm still trying to figure out.
I think it's really scary when people say, I like photography once it's in art, but I'm not really interested in it elsewhere. I mean, what relation to the world do you have? I mean,
Well,
and it's not uncommon actually that, and this does mark a difference, that there was a certain way that people interested in photography, this is only in the last generation or so, were really attracted to its artistic potential against the rest of the world, the rest of the fallen world with its, you know, debased image culture. It's not a sentimental position, because I cannot give up on popular culture. I cannot presume that popular culture will always be reduced to the populist. By populist, I mean, you know, playing to the lowest common denominator. If you go down that line, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And a number of high-minded artists, I find, who just have a kind of contempt for, I'm not saying you do, for the rest of image culture, is that's a symptom of something pretty bad, I think. And what is interesting about photographic practice before it was possible to entertain the fantasy of simply being a photographic artist was that most photographers didn't have that relation to popular culture. One, they couldn't, and two, there was much more of a stake in fighting for popular culture. In 1937, interestingly, Walker Evans and James Agee had seen Life magazine. Remember Life magazine? It had existed for a year at that point, and they saw that there was a kind of danger there. You know, it was sentimental in many ways. It was spectacular. It was consumerist, but it would not do to run away to the gallery or the precious livre d'artiste. You had to be in there fighting. So they put in a proposal to Henry Luce, who owned Time Incorporated, to say, will you devolve several pages in each issue for us to commission, you know, more open-ended experimental photography and writing? And it never happened, but they sat on the proposal for a while and they really thought about it. And actually James Agee and Evans never gave up on that idea, and they pursued it in other ways, you know, whether it was writings, film scripts, or working for magazines. But that's a genuinely kind of hybrid position, I think, where you have a relation to the culture that you live in. You don't like the way it's going, but you kind of know that running off to art is not going to do it, and it might be part of the problem. So I don't think it's sentimental. I think it's more realist, maybe more radical than that. I mean, I have lots of friends who work in various kinds of commercial photographic practice, and they're interested in precisely the things you're interested in, and I'm interested in. But they play out those battles within a field which have much larger stakes, actually, because the audiences are much larger and the battles have more kind of consequence. So no, I don't feel it's sentimental at all.
Well, I guess then I guess as coming from this, I'm just going to take this position for a moment, just because is the idea that from art then also becomes a field for which questions about where photography hasn't just gone, but where it could go, in such that the one thing about reaching back and trying to figure out, okay, are we going to make an archive? Am I going to make a modernist idiom photograph that relates to surrealism? Or, you know, trying to figure out a strategy for yourself as an artist, that a lot of these questions actually won't, and I'll dare say it, they probably won't be asked by someone who is trying to work inside a commercial realm on a daily basis. And this is a question where you could say I'm full of it, but part of the, and dare I say it, toxification of working in a commercial realm is that you slowly, unless you're really strong, the accretion of demands upon you will eventually release a submission part of your practice, such that you will forget that there were these things you were very interested in, and so that Evan's Subway Passengers was made in a kind of place of experimentation where I don't think there was those pressures for him to make it of the time, and he didn't even release it, so he even knew that it was just a kind of special thing. So there's something about photography when it stays in this kind of kind of isolated and maybe rarefied existence, that it can deal with some questions in stillness. You know, stillness is something that's sometimes a longer, more contemplative relationship to the photographic image. So I'm constantly curious, and all people making photographs today are constantly flipping through like Illustrated Workers magazine from 1920. You know, like everybody's constantly searching, as you say, searching the internet, trying to figure out what part of their hustle could I bring into my hustle, because there is so many different approaches when you divide each one. So most people in the art world tend to look their nose down at maybe who make photographs at the commercial photography way of working, but the fact of the matter is, it is what has given us a great many of these feelings we have for photography or art photography or art. Yet at the same token, there needs to be this other, I still think there needs to be this experimental space whereby all of that stuff can just go quiet and you can just focus. And I'm not sure that can happen in the high hustle realm of the fast-paced image-making world that we live in all the time.
Yeah, fair point. I mean, nobody said it was going to be a picnic. No, it's interesting. John Schakowsky, who was the head of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, felt that way. Actually felt that way about Evans. And when he came to do a big show of Evans's work in 1971, in his essay for the book accompanying that show, Schakowsky goes out of his way to say that, I mean, Evans was still alive at this point, to say that Evans had been softened and compromised softened by having a salary when he worked for Fortune magazine for 20 years, and compromised by its agenda, and therefore sort of dived right back to those extraordinary images that he made in 1936, 37, the famous Depression era pictures. And I think that Evans peaked as a picture maker then. But most photographers peak, if they're going to reach a high peak, they do it quite early. And the question then becomes, what do you do afterwards? Do you just sustain it? What was interesting for Evans is that he kind of had this feeling that, you know, being the photographer was not enough, that you had to take control of the editing, you had to take some control of the context. So he never joined an agency, never handed his pictures over or anything like that. Even when he had a show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1938, he locked himself in the night before with a bottle of whiskey and a bottle of glue and stuck his pictures to the wall, so worried he was that the curators would depart from his order, that he felt that the photography was as much about the order of the pictures as the pictures themselves. And then when he gets involved in doing things for magazines, it's all about controlling the layout and controlling, you know, writing the text to go with it, and then it gets really fascinating. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what is the craft complex of photography? Is it just the making of the picture, or is it to do with taking some kind of control of how those pictures get to the public? Are you just going to be beholden to an editor or a curator or something? That's an interesting fight to have, I think, for a photographer. That you've got to kind of look beyond the picture somehow.
But that leads me to my next question, and a lot of ink has been spent, I guess, in the last, well, since 1989, let's say, trying to make a claim that art photography exists in such a dominant way in our thoughts at times because of its relationship to tableau, or this long Western relationship to making of a picture. and I guess I wanted to ask you, and I didn't ask you this night, was, without naming writers, you know, just we know the arguments, we could rehearse them, that somehow tableau could be a way of thinking. Maybe you mentioned Evans and his kind of discursive way of wanting to lay out an exhibition, or even sequencing or framing, such that a tableau way of thinking may be some signs that the world of art was able to give life to photography in a way that just some of the machinations of it wouldn't. So that, you know, someone like Jean-François Chevrier says that tableau is when an artist literally is willing a picture into being.
Yeah.
That there is a will that may not be describable in some other aspects and uses of photography.
Wow, that's really beautifully put. Yeah, I don't think that goes away, but apart from, since we're in Vancouver, I'll mention him, apart from sort of Jeff Wall or you or a few others, I think what's interesting about photography, sort of since it became modern in the beginning of the 20s, has been seriality, you know, the making of more than one, the making of a body of work. What's really surprising, given all of this emphasis on the tableau, and I'm as enamored of that as anyone else, what's really surprising is how little photography is actually pursued in that way. Even if you look at the, you know, Michael Fried's book, you know, Why Photography Matters as Art as Never Before, which is essentially trying to make the case for the tableau. Even in his canon, you're still dealing with photographers who make large series. So the whole question of composition, which we think of as being central to the idea of the tableau, you know, the convincing ordering, pictorial ordering of the world. The idea of composition gets displaced away from the image and onto the composition of the group of pictures. You know, the body of work, the book, the exhibition, the sequence in that way. And that tells me that for all the commitment to the tableau in photography, it's always in some kind of dialectic with the many. You know, the fact that photography is something that you can pursue significantly artistically has numbers of pictures. Sorry. You know, when I see so many people go on and on and on about the tableau, I just think, well, you protest too much. You know, against what are you defending it? And I presume it's the common horde of pictures.
Well, that's why I mentioned it.
Yeah. It's funny, the last time I was in Vancouver, it was I co-founded a magazine called PA. Don't ask me what it stands for. But the idea for the magazine was that we would invite an artist to contribute to the magazine by asking them to choose and edit and sequence their work. So my co-editor said, well, who should we get then to do the first issue of the magazine with? You know? So I said, well, what about Jeff Wall, because he doesn't sequence his pictures, you know, it's just the tableau, capital T. So I flew all the way here, met Jeff at his studio, and I said, well, I'm starting this magazine now. Would you like to select and sequence your pictures? And, you know, instead of a kind of heavyweight critical essay unlimbering the work, mea culpa, I've done that before, could the pictures say something about each other through their organisation on the page? He just said, I don't do sequences. And then he said, well, you know, you do it. So he kind of gave me JPEGs of everything, and I sat up in the hotel and kind of worked out what I thought was an interesting sequence. And he looks at it and he said, yeah, no, actually, I do have to sequence them, you know, because whenever I don't exhibit them singularly, I'm always having to think actually about the relation between them. I think his analogy is something sort of with big cats in the zoo, you know, they have to be kept apart, otherwise they eat each other. But I still think there's a relation between his pictures, and there could be. And I mean, the ideal presentation of the tableau would be a single image exhibition, and that just never happens, you know. So one is always thinking about the relation between the one and the many. And I just think that that's what's really fascinating in photography. You know, composition that's internal to the frame, and then composition that's to do with, well, what happens when you stand in the gallery outside and you look at this subway portrait and this one, or this over-painted photograph, and then you move to that one. It doesn't diminish the singularity of it, but it kind of, it's enriched by, you know, you're composing a show out of essentially, you know, kind of tableau work. Well, some of it's serial. That would be my...
Well, thinking about the many, though, I mean, the singularity of a tableau picture. For instance, let's take an artist like Paul Graham, UK photographer who's been working for a long time in series, we could say. Starting from his early pictures in waiting rooms in UK institutions, moving through graffiti pictures, moving through things that he's done in the last 4 or 5 years, which is traveling around the US and taking a poetic, experiential practice stuffed through a kind of street photographic relationship, and then back out to make large tableau pictures, but then exhibited at varying heights in the gallery such that they feel like tableaus, but they're part of the many. But when you have a practice like that, his work rests on the fact that he's been working in the many for so long that we somehow feel that is where his practice rests. But in terms of what, say, Chevrolet is talking about, it's almost like the theoretical artist that doesn't exist. If I was to understand you correctly, that there is no artist who's actually just making a tableau in this singular way. Like at the end of a subway station, you would just have one picture behind bulletproof glass, and that would be it. And that would be your complete oof, which is not going to happen. So the thing is then tableau, the idea of just making a picture which is more complicated than just grabbing it as pure observation without thought, quote unquote. Is there a way to now, today, maybe you could say something about a poetic document that exists, a way of making a photograph that has ingested and now eaten all of our conversations about art photography and tableau, such that you can't go back, you can't be Gary Winogrand anymore. You must be this animal that's eaten all of this stuff.
Oh, what's so lovely about Gary Winogrand is that, you know, he couldn't edit for toffee. You know, he said, I never made a good book. You know, I could never. You know, photography began and ended with the snap of the shutter. He was barely interested in printing any of those things. And there are others like that. You know, Cartier-Bresson couldn't edit, although he was, you know, arguably the best tableau photographer there's been. You know, just in terms of making single, exemplary, extraordinary pictures, and dozens and dozens and dozens of them, but never took on the idea of you know, the organised body of work. You know, when The Decisive Moment was published in 1952, he didn't do it. His publisher did it. Kind of organised all the pictures. I can think of something that does sweep all of this up in an interesting way, but it probably wouldn't be what you're thinking of. If we take everything that we've been talking about, God, I'm going to load such a lot onto this image, but why not? Everything we've been saying about the relation between artistic practice and commercial practice, everything we've been saying about obsolescence and the analog and the digital and the idea of doing something exemplary in whatever context, I think this is a really interesting example. This is a record sleeve. You're looking at the front and the back of a 12-inch record sleeve by another Evans, Jason Evans, who works in all kinds of commercial fields, but also has exhibitions. He was showing in Toronto not long ago. He does editorial work. He does commercial portraiture. He was just photographing Ronaldo in Madrid last week. And although the way his MO is completely contemporary, I think he's representative of a certain number of photographers who would prefer that rather hybrid condition of photography between art and commerce. I mean, art is commerce. I don't even like the idea that there's commercial photography and then there's art. It's a bit weird, isn't it? It doesn't really work like that. So what are we looking at here? Well, Fortet is a guy called Kieran Hebden, and he makes music that is a mixture of acoustic and electronic sounds. Very beautiful music. And Jason Evans has designed record sleeves for him for the last 15 years. And he gets sent the record and he listens to it and then he tries to make a kind of equivalent. So Jason says to himself, okay, well what would be a photographic equivalent of this instrumental music, which is a combination of acoustic and electronic? So, what are you looking at? I'll tell you how the picture was made. And if you look closely, it could only have been made this way. Jason went round the commercial digital printing labs in London several mornings in a row to collect up the prints that they make to test that the printers are working. So colour spectrums, flowers, grids. You know, every commercial lab prints out their test images every day. Kodak used to do it in its own way. He collects these up, he takes them back to the studio. So this is kind of a digital output. Pins them up on the studio wall. So we've got the idea of the kind of pinboard aesthetic going on there, with which this show opens. He then photographs it on 4x5, negative, and he gets a hole punch, like a stationer's hole punch. Hole punch is the negative. And then with a pair of tweezers, arranges those discs on a glass plate, and then makes a photographic print of it. And if you look closely, it could only have been made in that way. And so that's a kind of digital analog equivalent of electronic acoustic music. I think it's every bit as interesting as any art photographer exploring the analog materiality, abstraction, figuration, the current status of the technology, all of those questions. More to the point, there's a very interesting and actually kind of high modernist relation to context here, because what you're looking at is the 12-inch record cover. If you were to buy the CD, it would look like that. So the dots remain the same size. If you go onto iTunes, it looks like that. You know, the icon. Well, that's a very smart, intelligent practice. Every bit as sophisticated as anything you'd find in art. And Jason makes art, he's not anti-art or anything like that. He just knows that art doesn't have anything like a monopoly on this kind of thinking. And if you go back historically, that's how photographers thought. You know, Man Ray, while being a kind of cutting-edge avant-garde artist, is an extremely well-paid fashion photographer. Someone like Jermaine Kroll, who's kind of almost forgotten, or Laura Alban-Guillot, who would, you know, set you alight if you actually got to see their work. Nobody really exhibits it anymore. They just saw the whole cultural field as potentially interesting, and it would be wrong to give up on any part of it and presume that simply because it was harder to do good work in certain, quote, commercial fields, that you should somehow give it up and go somewhere else. So I come back to my original point that if you're like me and you're just interested in photography, you end up connecting with practices that are interesting everywhere, and I just don't see art as, you know, I'm someone who's written books called things like art and photography. It's not that I'm down on it or anything. It's just that I just can't see, particularly now when it's so appallingly cynical and commercialized. And I talk to students, and all they want is a fucking career out of it.
I've loved.
I can't see that that's any more of a special realm than anywhere else. No less so, but no more so.